Hello and welcome to Strik by byBreuer. If you translate Strik by byBreuer to English, it means knit by byBreuer. I'm a knitter and my name is byBreuer, and hence the name of my knitting podcast. And I would also like to say welcome to Knitathon, the 8th in a row. And thanks so much to Pia for coordinating these 24 hours so we can sit and knit and spend time with families and friends, or knit alone, or whichever combination of that we prefer. Today I'm actually sitting together with knitting friends in Horsens in Jylland. And I will, of course, be sitting in the chat and talk to you now. So welcome to Knitathon and welcome to Strik by byBreuer. Yeah, should we start this? This episode is not a regular episode. It's not going to be a traditional knitting podcast where I show my work in progress and my yarns and my notions and all that. This is going to be about something completely different. It's going to be about the history of knitting. And before we start, I would like to come with a small disclaimer. I am not a professional historian. I am not a professional knitting historian. I'm actually an office clerk in my daily job, and I'm just fascinated by knitting and the history of knitting. So what I'll share with you today is based on research that I have done online primarily, and on books that I have read into, and of course also articles that I have been able to find. But there will be errors, and there will be details where proper knitting historians, they could say that that is perhaps not true, that is more legendary than fact. So see this as a storytelling journey rather than a strict academic lecture, which it isn't. It is more, as I said, a storytelling. So it will, of course, be based on what I have been able to find. So if you can accept that disclaimer, then you're more than welcome to stay here. So today's episode is special. Because we are going to explore the history of knitting. Before I even start that, I have a lot of lights coming in. I'm sitting here. It's evening. It's 2 days before this actually airs, and I have a television screen in front of me because I think it's so important that I get some of these things right, that I have written a small manuscript, and in order for me not to sit here and read it from it, I have it on a screen behind my camera. So I hope you can forgive that there's lights in my glasses. No. Yeah, back to my story about the history of knitting. The origins of knitting is not known. It is more sort of in the haze where it began, how the technique actually derived, and we know certain stuff, and there's a lot of things we don't know. So unlike, for instance, stone tools or pottery or whatever you can find in the soil, textiles actually rarely survive. They decay, they rot, sometimes they're even reused to make something new. So that is also my theory, that this is one of the reasons why we haven't found that much knitting in archaeological digs. There simply isn't any, because they have been reused. The earliest evidence that we have of something that is very close to knitting comes from Egypt. There has been excavations, archaeological excavations, that goes as far back as 7,000 years from today, where you have found some split toe socks, and you have also found some fragments that it's not really known what these fragments are. And in the beginning, you actually thought one actually thought that that was what we nowadays call knitting, but it turned out that it wasn't. It was needle binding, also called nålebinding in Danish. So until they could really put them in the microscope and see that it wasn't knitted, and knitting as we know today with 2 needles and 1 long thread, but it was needle bound. Needle binding is where you have 1 needle, a regular. It's not a regular needle. It's a thick needle, and so where you have a short thread, and then you just basically needle the textile together instead. You sew it. And but needle binding actually looks quite similar to knitting, but it is quite different, because the definition of knitting is 2 needles and a long continuous thread. But so that is actually what we know. We don't know that much about the early the early history about knitting. But by the time we go to the Middle Ages, then we can see that there is actually true knitting. So this is the youngest of the textile producing techniques that we know. We have weaving, we have crocheting, and we have needle binding, and then knitting actually comes along. So it's one of the youngest techniques that we know, but once it appeared, it actually spread out surprisingly quickly. So there might have been something that has come before that. Knitting as we know it seems to have emerged in the Islamic world. Some of the early surviving pieces of actual knitting has also been found in Egypt. And these fragments, they have some elaborate patterns on them, and sometimes they have found what seems to be Arabic scripts. So from there, knitting spread into Spain, and Spain in the early Middle Ages, they were Islamic in some parts and Christian in other parts. And it's most likely that knitting traveled along these trade routes of Islamic and Christian path that they took. So by the 13th and 14th centuries, we see actual knitted items appearing in Europe. For instance, there are knitted cushions that are known from king's tombs. There are religious garments that you can see on paintings. And you can also see what is called the knitting Madonna. She's actually knitting on a painting. So you can see that is knitting. She's sitting with double pointed needles. So, and one of the oldest surviving knitted items that has been found in Europe is a pair of beautifully detailed silk stockings that was made for a Spanish prince in the 1200s, I think it's called. So, and yeah, I have to scroll down, so I'm sitting with my mouse next to me. See if that can, it works. And knitting in these early days of recorded knitting was considered a luxury. It was not something that you did in the ordinary households. It was really a luxury. The people that did it were really skilled artisans, and there was actually knitting guilds. So, and when you have a guild and you have something that is only sold to the aristocracy and the nobility, then it's men doing these crafts. So yes, in the Middle Ages, knitting was dominated by men. Then the knitting guilds, they began in Paris in France in the 1600s. And if you wanted to become a master knitter, you had to go through a long apprenticeship. And sometimes that could last up to 5 or 6 years. And when you had finished your apprenticeship, you had to produce a masterpiece. And that could be a carpet, it could be a pair of stockings, or it could be a hat or a beret or something like that. And only once you have passed that test, you could be accepted into the guild and be a master knitter. And all these guild knitters, they're professional. And they sold all the knits and they produced the most beautiful, intricate knittings, but that was only for the wealthy. And especially the stockings. Stockings in those days, they were knit of silk, and they were hand knitted. And they were hand knitted on a European needle, 0.75. I don't know how many zeros that is in the US needle sizes, but it's a lot, I guess. So European needle size 0.75. So the demand for stocking, they really exploded in the 16th century. Queen Elizabeth I of England, she really, really loved her silk stockings. And once she had tried them on, she never wanted to go back to the woven hoses. That was the term for when you had a woven fabric and you made that into socks or stockings. It was called a hose. So silk stockings became a symbol for nobility and elegance. By the 15th and 16th century, the ordinary people, they also began to knit. But they didn't knit with silk. They knit with, they used wool. And instead of luxury goods, they made everyday necessities that you really were in need of, because there was no central heating in those days, and there were no thermal windows either. So they knitted warm socks, they knitted gloves, they knitted hats and sweaters. And for instance, in Scotland, entire communities depended on knitting for survival, but not because they would knit for themselves. They also did that, but they also knitted as a supplement for their income. They knitted sweaters, they knitted stockings and socks that they could sell at the market. And in those days, when you were a child, you learned how to knit almost before you could hold on to a needle. It wasn't, of course, the case, but you were really young when you learned to knit, because the household was dependent on it. In the Shetland Isles, knitting was deeply woven into the daily life and culture. Shetland wool and later Shetland lace would later become really world famous. And knitting traditions also developed into unique regional identities. If you think of Aran sweaters in Ireland, or the colorworks of Fair Isles, that is still something that we can see today, and that they still have their own knitting styles that we all know and love. In the 1500s, there was a radical change that came into knitting, one that would eventually reshape the entire craft. And that was the development of a knitting machine. In 1589, an English clergyman called William Lee, he designed a knitting frame that later developed into the knitting machine. The story goes, even though it's just what I have been able to find out, William Lee was inspired, or perhaps he was a bit frustrated, when he watched a woman. He always had knit. The women always had knit in the hand, knitting in the hand. That's what it's called. Some accounts actually say that that woman that he was talking about was his sweetheart or even his wife. I don't know. It could be legend. But at least that made him develop the knitting frame. I have tried to find some footage, no, not footage, some drawings and some paintings of it. That is really difficult to show here on YouTube because most of them are protected by some kind of license. So I have chosen not to show any pictures just in order to be safe. But Lee, he did indeed invent a machine that could mimic the movements of the knitting needles and do that looping of the threads. The knitting frame also used a row of hooked needles that could be manipulated into forming loops in yarn, row after row. So it was an early form of a knitting machine, but knitted fabric was instead of woven. And in those days, machines weren't actually that common. So imagine, we also know it today, right? When we are sitting and hand knitting, we know that knitting a pair of socks takes, 7 to 15 hours to knit a pair of socks. That could now be done in an hour. That must have been really revolutionary. But Lee's invention actually faced a lot of resistance. He went to Queen Elizabeth I of England, hoping for a bit of a royal support and presenting his knitting frame, but the Queen wasn't really impressed. She preferred her hand-knitted stockings because they were finer and not so coarse as the machine-knitted ones were. It's also said that she refused to grant him a patent because she was afraid that that would put all the hand knitters out of work. So, what Lee did, he took his machine home with him. He couldn't get a patent in England, so he took it to France, where he received a bit more support. From there, the knitting frame slowly began to spread across Europe, and by the 17th century, it was more a knitting machine than a knitting frame, and therefore we all ended up with having knitting machines all over Europe. This knitting frame or knitting machine didn't instantly wipe out all hand knitters. Hand knitters, first of all, the frame was way too expensive to build, and it was also difficult to maintain. It actually required skilled workers to operate it. But it did mark the beginning of industrial knitting. Of course, these machine knittings, they also brought tension. In the 18th and 19th centuries, industrialization was in full swing, and hand knitters in especially rural areas often couldn't compete with these cheaper and faster products that came out of the machines. And that actually led to protest. Have you ever heard about the Ludites? I think, as far as I have been able to find out, Ludites, they were a rebellious hand knitters in England who actually smashed knitting machines and looms in protest because they was losing their livelihood. So these knitting machines, they were actually direct tied to that unrest that happened in the UK. By the 19th century, the knitting machines had improved so much that they could produce lace-like patterns and very fine fabrics that was really rivaling the handwork in a lot of ways. But hand-knitted items actually remained important, just both because of practicality, but also culturally. It was a skill that was taught to children. It was something that you could always do. It was said that non-working hands were lazy hands, So it was really important that you had something in your hands at all times. You could always knit. You could be done in any place, anywhere, and you don't need a knitting machine to do that. So luckily, the knitting machine didn't destroy the hand knitting. It just transformed it into something else. What we did now, instead of just producing all these necessities, then we also produced something that was more artistic, something that was extremely beautiful, and that we all would like to have, and not that we just needed to have. That part is still with us today. When we pick up the needles, we're doing something deliberately slow and extremely human. And it is in a world where machines and digitalization is going faster and faster, and I don't think we can always follow along. So therefore we need hand knitting to just slow down pace and sit down and have calm. One of the most powerful chapters in knitting's history comes during the times of war. For instance, during World War I, knitting became a really patriotic duty. Women and children, they were encouraged to knit socks for their loved ones, the soldiers that was at the front. And posters and pamphlets called for knitters for the nation to do their part and make sure that the soldiers, they had socks and mittens and hats. So millions and millions of items, they were shipped around in Europe in order to keep soldiers warm. And in both World Wars and also in the American Civil War, knitting also took a secret role. It actually played a part in espionage. Knitting called to be used for as passing code and messages. There were stories, some true, some perhaps a bit. I don't know if they're exaggerated, but at least it's more legendary stories than it's actual facts. That women, they were sitting by the railway lines and knitting, and they kept track of the enemy troops that was moving and encoded that information into their knitting. At the same time, wartime rationing meant that knitters, they had to be extremely creative. So that thing that they were knitting to pass on messages and that there was a scarcity of yarn, these two things doesn't really add up. But I think it's a really nice story that knitters, they were knitting in order to relay their information to the Allies. And what you then did in order to get yarn, old sweaters and socks and that stuff like that, that was unraveled. You could also go and buy some old machine knitted sweaters and unravel them, and then you can reuse the yarn. And patterns, they were published that taught people to make, do, and mend. So that was what people did. So after the wars in the earliest 20th century, knitting came into a complete new phase. No longer was wartime a necessity to knit, and it became more a sort of a domestic skill, something that mothers and grandmothers did at home quietly and a homely activity. Especially in the 1950s, knitting was everywhere. Women's magazines published countless patterns for jumpers, cardigans, dresses, sweaters for men, and baby clothes. Everything that could be knitted was knitted. Shops sold knitting kits. You couldn't actually buy a knitting pattern without also buying yarn. And so all these nice kits, they promised that you could do a stylish sweater at home. And that was actually for much, much less than you could do when you bought it ready-made. At the same time, knitting was tied to gender. It was considered part of a woman's duty to clothe the family, to knit socks for the husband, or a christening gown for the baby. By the 70s and the 80s, things began to change again. The mass production of extremely cheap clothes, that meant that knitting was no longer an economical necessity. And so why would you spend weeks on producing a sweater when you could buy one in a shop that was really a fraction of the cost? And you could also have it now. That's actually still the case. Now it's just way more expensive to knit one yourself than it is to buy one. And in a lot of countries and a lot of places, knitting actually fell completely out of fashion. It was seen as something only grandmas did. So it was really old-fashioned, and that was especially among the young people. And yet, in the 1980s, there was also a parallel rise in creative experimentation, because designers started to use knitting in bold new ways. There was extremely oversized sweaters. Do you remember these sweaters where we had shoulder paddings in? There was some wild color works. There was blocking in the sweaters. There was experimental shapes. You know, these bat wing sleeves that we had. There was basically one big sweater with sleeves all the way down to the waist. So while everyday hand-knitted pieces like a regular sweater, a regular hand-knitted hat, or a pair of mittens or something like that, that really became out of fashion, knitting as an art and fashion statement, that really became alive. And I can actually remember that. I was sitting in my high school and knitted, and I remember there was a lot of cobalt and a lot of mohair. That's what I remember. Then in the early 2000s, Ravelry actually came up, and that is still a community for knitters that was founded in 2007, and that connected knitters around the entire world. Suddenly, you could share your projects, you could ask for help, you could publish your own designs, and it would be exposed to thousands and thousands of people. This digital community helped knitting become more inclusive and visible than ever before. And even men began to knit again, and younger knitters actually joined in, and the old stereotype of the granny with needles would start to crack open. What you also saw in these years was Instagram. There was a boom in knitters on Instagram, and the hashtag also started to appear in the early tenors. That also helped to visualize and feel as you were part of a community. And then came 2020. The world literally shut down. When the coronavirus hit, it forced people to stay indoors, or at least at home. And many of us was looking for comfort, for focus, and something to do with our hands during these long days at home. We also was exposed to a lot of screen time and a lot of digital communication. So in order to do that, we had to have some old-fashioned craft that we could sit with. And therefore, knitting was one of the crafts that had a surge in popularity. It almost exploded. Yarn shops, they reported of huge increases in online orders. There could be delivery times of 3 to 4 weeks on a special types of yarn because the manufacturers couldn't really follow along. And designers, they saw their patterns downloaded more than they have ever seen before. knitting and handcrafting, knitting and crocheting actually, that fitted that moment perfectly. It was slow, it was meditative, and it was tactile. An antidote to the endless screen time. It gave people the sense of progress. You could see how far you had knitted, as you can see here. It's an actual fabric that you're getting, an actual item that you get out of it. You could sit there row by row, stitch by stitch, and everything else just felt around you just felt uncertain. And it also offered a community. When you were on the screen anyway, you could meet online, you could meet virtually in online knit-alongs on Instagram. There were challenges, there were YouTube tutorials, there were YouTube knitting podcasts that started. There was Zoom and what was the other? I don't remember what the other meeting place was called. So there was a lot of different things that you could do online when it came to knitting. Even though we were physically apart, knitting gave us a way to feel connected and as a community. You were never alone when you were knitting. And during these times, there were some designers and projects that became really well known in these years. For instance, Stephen West, he is an Amsterdam-based designer, and he is extremely famous for his colorful shawls. And he started to run some mystery knit-alongs during the pandemic, where thousands of knitters worldwide, they joined on a weekly basis. That is actually going on right now. I just saw that Clue 1 came out today, Thursday, the 2nd of October. It might even have come out the 1st of October. I shouldn't. Yeah, I think it came out yesterday, actually, 1st of October. And some of his patterns that came out during these October mystery knit-alongs, for instance, Slips Stravaganza, that gave knitters something to look forward to. It gave them a community. And it was also surprising, which it still is actually. You don't know what is coming in the following week. And sometimes the days they could feel really like same. And then the knitting pattern from Stephen West came and you had something else to do that you weren't aware of that you had been needing. So that was really something good. And here in Denmark, for instance, Hanne Remmen, a Danish designer, and Petit Knit, they both saw a huge rise in attention. Petit Knit in particular, I think we all know her. She became something of a household name in these days. It's because she has a modern and straightforward go-to. So even if you are a new knitter, you can always knit a Petit Knit pattern because it's really well described. You can see what you're getting, and it's also simple. There's no frills to that. There was also something called community projects that popped up during the coronavirus. For instance, the Danish designer Lærke Bagger, she ran online knit-alongs that connected Danish knitters virtually. She came out with a sweater called Alone Together sweater. And that was actually for free during the Corona years. I haven't really checked up if that is still available and if it's still for free. But these gatherings, that is something that has continued afterwards. I know of knitters that is still meeting in online communities. And I can see that there are still a lot of knit-alongs that takes place, for instance, on Instagram and on YouTube. I myself had one knit-along, and I really enjoyed it. So there's also good things that has come out of the coronavirus. But perhaps the most important thing about the period of coronavirus and what came out of it was there was many knitters who shared their what picking up the needles actually did for their mental health. Because when anxiety and loneliness ran high in these days, knitting offered focus, rhythm, and some calm. That sense of structure, when you're sitting there finishing one row, you can see the fabric, the textile is growing. That actually gave people some stability, and I think it also gave them hope, because they didn't feel like they were alone with their knitting. They had all the online communities around them, but you also feel that sense of calmness. There's actually a Danish psychology called Anne Kirketab. She has developed a psychological theory called craft psychology. So if you don't know Anne Kirketab, look into that one. That is the repetition of a craft that you are doing and how it benefits your mental health. By the time the world began to open again, knitting had not only survived the pandemic, it had thrived. It was really going well for knitting. A whole new wave of knitters had discovered the craft, and a lot of them have actually stayed also afterwards. Social media made their projects visible, and suddenly the craft wasn't hidden away anymore in living rooms and you were sitting all by yourself. It was really public, it was really stylish, and it was also extremely creative. Knitting has shown, once again, how it adapts. Whatever the world throws at us knitters, if it's industrialization, if it's wars or global pandemics, people continue to turn to yarn and needles, not just to make things, but to find comfort, resilience, and community. And this is why I really love knitting. I have found so many friendships online, and I also found friendships in the real world among knitters. And I really thank you all for that. To finalize this, I would like to talk about knitting in culture and also in symbolism, because knitting is so much more than just a way of making clothes. Yes, it is practical, and yes, it is keeping us warm and is keeping us dressed and a lot of other things, but it also carries a deep layer of meaning and symbolism. Many of them are actually unspoken, but they are more or less universally understood. At its core, knitting symbolizes care. If you think of a grandmother who is knitting a pair of socks for her grandchild, or a mother making a baby blanket for her newborn, I think most knitting moms has actually done that. These objects are more than just fabric. They are hours of time. They are made with love. And when somebody once in a while says, I made this for you, what they're also saying is, I thought of you with every row I was knitting, and I made it with love. So this is why hand-knitted gifts feel so different from something that is just bought in a shop. For me, at least, they are physical expressions of love for the ones that I'm doing it for. And yeah, that's how it is. If you have ever received a knitted gift from me, it's because I love you. Knitting also symbolizes patience. There it is. Because it can take so long. It can take, to produce a sweater, it can take months. It can really take months. And a lace shawl, even longer. I've just finished I have knitted a dress that took me from January until September. So knitting, it actually demands us to slow down in our pace. And we have to accept that the progress is really slow. It happens stitch by stitch. And in this fast-paced world that we're living in now, it's I feel it's like a rebellion against it, that we always have to be fast, and everything just has to run so quickly. So when I'm sitting down and I'm knitting, I am focused on that and nothing else. Another layer of symbolism in knitting is connectivity and connection. Because when we knit, we are joining a chain of centuries of other knitters that has knitted before us. What I like to do once in a while is see if I can dig out some really old knitting patterns, which doesn't make sense actually. They were so short. They was just pick up 200 stitches, knit 20 centimeters, do an increase for sleeves, bind off. If you had done that 3 times, 2 for the front and 1 for the back, then you had a sweater or a cardigan. Today, it doesn't make sense. We have 30, 40 pages of knitting patterns nowadays, but in those days, it could be done on 1 page. I think it had to do with that you learned how to knit as a really young kid, and there you just learned how a sweater would be knitted. There wasn't that many different shoulder types. There wasn't that many patterns for creating the actual bodice. So that might be why. So I think I have to conclude now, otherwise I will perhaps go over my time. When we look at knitting today, we can see that it's so much more than just a craft. It's actually a language without words. It can, if you will, express love. It can express defiance. It can express identity. It can express community, patience, and hope. A humble pair of socks might be the act of care. A lace shawl might be the work of devotion from the knitter to the receiver. And sometimes knitting is simply just for ourselves, a way of saying, I'm here and I'm making something that matters for me. That was it for me. Thank you so much for staying along for this knitting journey. And I hope that you have perhaps a deeper understanding of what knitting is and where it comes from. And I also hope you have a deeper appreciation of the craft that we all love. But I just hope that you still love your knitting. And yeah, I think that was all for me. If you want to have a look at my Instagram page, it's by_Breuer. And if you want to subscribe to the channel, you're more than welcome. It's primarily in Danish. I have 1 episode from the Knitathon last autumn that's in English as well. But if you understand Danish, or if you want to have subtitles, you're more than welcome to follow along on my YouTube channel as well. So thank you for staying here for the past 45 minutes, and hope to see you soon again. Bye-bye.